James thought he had it all: a loving wife, a home, and a future full of promise. But a devastating accident leaves him clinging to life, only to uncover a shocking betrayal that changes everything. Will James rise from the ashes of his broken world? Watch till the end to find out this incredible journey of loss, strength, and rebirth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's just one click for you, but a huge motivation for us. James felt like he was floating in a void. No ground beneath him, no sense of direction. Then, out of the blackness, pain emerged, sharp and relentless, piercing through his skull like a jagged blade. His thoughts were disjointed, like shattered glass trying to form a whole. Slowly, fragments of memory surfaced. The hum of his motorcycle, the wind whipping through his hair, and the intoxicating feeling of freedom. He had been alive, so vividly alive. And now, this. As his senses began to awaken, James realized he wasn't alone. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and the faint hum of machines surrounded him. Tubes pressed against his skin, connecting him to devices that beeped in rhythmic intervals. Though his body felt immobile, his mind raced with questions. Where am I? What happened? Then he heard it, a voice that broke through the haze. Soft, familiar, and tinged with a calmness that didn't match the situation. It was Emily, his wife. "Doctor, I need to know how long?" she asked, her tone steady but cold. The words floated to him as though carried on a distant breeze. James strained to hear the reply, desperate for answers. "It's hard to say," the doctor responded. "His condition is critical. But I will say this: there's hope. His parents believe he can pull through." Hope, James thought. He tried to move, to speak, to make his presence known, but his body refused to obey. His mind screamed for attention, but the silence was deafening. Emily sighed heavily. "Doctor, Hope is dangerous. He's not waking up. He hasn't moved, hasn't shown any sign of improvement. I think it's time to consider letting him go." Those words struck James like a thunderclap. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. "Letting me go?" Emily's voice, usually a source of comfort, now carried an icy finality that filled him with dread. He tried again to shout, to move, to do anything that would let her know he was still here. The doctor hesitated. "I understand this is difficult for you, but his parents have asked for more time. They're not ready to give up on him." "They're clinging to false hope," Emily said sharply. "You and I both know he's not coming back. It's cruel to keep him like this." James felt his heart race, though his body didn't respond. "No, I'm here. I'm alive," he wanted to scream, to plead with her not to give up on him. His mind burned with the injustice of it all, but the realization was sinking in. She had already made up her mind. The doctor, however, was not swayed. "It's not my decision to make," he replied gently, "but I urge you to think this through carefully. I'll leave you alone to consider your options." James heard footsteps retreating and the sound of the door closing. The room fell into an eerie silence. It was just him and Emily now. "James," she whispered, her voice softer now, "I can't do this anymore. I can't watch you like this. You're not coming back, and your mother, she just won't accept it. But I know it's time to let you go." Her words were a knife twisting in his chest. He could feel the weight of her despair, but it was mixed with something else. Relief. There was a detachment in her tone that made it clear this wasn't just grief. It was a decision, calculated and final. James felt panic surge through him. He couldn't let this happen. He wasn't ready to die, not like this, not when he could still hear, still think, still feel. Summoning every ounce of strength within him, he willed his body to move, to respond. His fingers twitched imperceptibly, but it wasn't enough. Desperation overtook him and he forced a sound, small, guttural, but undeniably human. Emily froze. "James?" she whispered, her voice sharp with alarm. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she stared at his face. "James? Are you—" The door burst open, and the doctor and a nurse hurried in. Emily backed away as they approached, their movements swift and purposeful. The nurse leaned over him, checking his vitals, while the doctor observed closely. "He's responding," the nurse said, her voice filled with surprise. "Look, his fingers and his breathing. It's stronger." James could feel their attention on him, their voices buzzing around him like an electrical current. He wasn't fully conscious, not yet, but the spark of life was undeniable. The doctor nodded gravely. "He's coming out of it." Relief washed over James, but it was short-lived. He couldn't trust Emily, not after what he'd heard. He needed time to think, to process, to act. When the doctor leaned closer, James summoned every ounce of strength he had left and mouthed a single plea. "Don't tell her." The doctor's eyes widened briefly, but he nodded in understanding. "We'll need to monitor him closely," he said aloud, addressing the nurse. "Let's make sure he's stable before we inform anyone." Emily watched them with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What's happening? Is he improving?" The doctor turned to her with a measured expression. "It's too early to say. Let's give him some time and see how he responds." Emily's shoulders slumped and she nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if nothing changes, we'll have to make a decision soon." As she left the room, James felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but he had something he hadn't had before, a chance. And he would use it to fight for his life, no matter the cost. The cold air of the hospital lobby stung James as he stepped out, his body still weak but his resolve unshaken. Days had passed since his miraculous recovery, days spent silently observing, gathering his strength, and plotting his next move. Emily had no idea that he was alive, fully aware, and preparing to confront the truth she had so casually discarded. He had to see it for himself, her betrayal. The ride home was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the car's engine. The driver, a hospital-arranged transport, didn't pry, though James knew he must have questions. His face was still pale, his movements deliberate and slow, but his mind raced. Memories of Emily's voice in that hospital room haunted him. Her calculated tone, the coldness of her words, the way she had dismissed his parents' hope as foolish. The car pulled into the driveway and James's breath hitched. It was his home, but something felt different. The curtains were drawn shut and a faint glow from the living room hinted at life inside. "She's here." James stepped out of the car, his legs trembling slightly as he adjusted to the weight of standing. The driver offered assistance, but he waved him off. This was his moment, and he needed to face it alone. He unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside. The familiar scent of his home hit him, a mix of cedar wood and the faint vanilla candle Emily used to light. But beneath the nostalgia was an unease that gnawed at him. Voices. James froze. From the living room, he heard muffled laughter, low and intimate. He took slow, deliberate steps, careful not to make a sound, until he reached the doorway. His heart thundered in his chest as he peered inside. There she was. Emily, seated on the couch, her legs tucked under her, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years. Across from her, a man leaned forward, his hand brushing hers as they laughed together. James's vision blurred with rage. She moved on. She didn't even wait. The hospital wasn't even a memory in his rearview mirror, and here she was, cozying up to someone else in their home. "Emily," he said, his voice low but firm. Her head snapped up and the color drained from her face. The man beside her stiffened, confusion etched across his features. "James?" Emily's voice trembled as she rose to her feet, her body frozen in shock. "Yes, it's me," James replied, his tone cold as steel. He stepped fully into the room, his presence commanding despite the weakness still lingering in his frame. "Surprised to see me alive?" Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked between James and the man, who had now risen as well, his posture defensive. I thought you thought I wouldn't make it." James cut her off, his voice rising. "Thought you'd just move on with him?" He pointed at the man, who flinched under the weight of James's glare. "This isn't what it looks like," Emily stammered, stepping toward him. James raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't. Just don't." His voice cracked with emotion. "I heard you, Emily. I heard everything. You wanted to give up on me. You were ready to let me die." Tears welled in her eyes, but James wasn't swayed. "Do you know what it felt like, lying there, helpless, listening to you talk about pulling the plug?" His voice broke as the pain poured out of him. "You didn't even fight for me. You just gave up." Emily shook her head, her tears spilling over. "James, Save it," he snapped. His gaze shifted to the man who was now inching toward the door. "And who the hell is this? How long has this been going on?" The man raised his hands in defense. "I didn't know. She told me." "Get out," James barked, his voice thundering through the room. The man didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his coat and bolted out the door, leaving Emily and James alone in the silence that followed. Emily sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "I was grieving, James." "I thought you were gone." "Grieving?" James laughed bitterly. "You were laughing with him, Emily. That didn't look like grief to me." "I didn't know how to handle it," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought you were gone, and I was lonely." James stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You didn't even wait to see if I'd pull through. You didn't give me a chance. And now you expect me to forgive this?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect anything. James, I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You betrayed me, Emily. You betrayed us." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy but resolute. "I'm changing the locks tomorrow. Don't bother coming back." "James, please." Her voice was cut off by the slam of the door. Outside, James leaned against the wall, his chest heaving with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The betrayal burned in his veins, but beneath it was a deeper pain, a sense of loss that cut him to his core. But even in the depths of his despair, one thought remained clear. This was not the end. He would rebuild, piece by piece, starting now. James stood in the quiet of his now empty home, the weight of his confrontation with Emily settling on his shoulders. The silence was deafening, amplifying every thought racing through his mind. This was his house, his life, and yet it felt foreign, as if he were stepping into the ruins of someone else's existence. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, willing himself to focus. This wasn't the end. It was a chance to rebuild. The following days were consumed by practicalities. James filed for divorce, cutting the final ties to the woman who had betrayed him. The legal process was draining, but he faced it with a cold determination. Emily's response was swift and clear. She wanted nothing. She forfeited her share of their assets, unwilling to engage in a drawn-out battle. It was almost too easy, and James couldn't help but feel the sting of how quickly she let go. Each night, the loneliness crept in. The house felt cavernous without Emily's presence, even though her betrayal had tainted every corner of it. He avoided their bedroom, opting to sleep on the couch in the living room. It wasn't comfort he sought, but distance from the memories that lingered in the spaces they had once shared. The days blurred together until James realized he hadn't left the house in over a week. He stared at himself in the bathroom mirror, his reflection unrecognizable. The hollows under his eyes and the lines etched into his face told the story of a man weighed down by grief and betrayal. Enough was enough. He needed to step outside to reconnect with the world beyond these walls. He decided to take a walk through the park, a place he hadn't visited in years. The fresh air was sharp and bracing, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of clarity. As he strolled along the paths, the chatter of families and the laughter of children created a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. He envied their simplicity, their freedom from the pain that had consumed him. As he rounded a bend, a familiar face caught his eye. It was the nurse who had cared for him during his hospital stay. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she was sitting on a bench reading a book. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach, but something about her presence drew him in. She had been a source of calm in his darkest moments, and now, more than ever, he needed that again. "Hi," he said, his voice tentative as he stopped a few feet away. She looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "James, I didn't expect to see you here. How are you feeling?" Her genuine concern caught him off guard. "Better, I think," he replied. "Physically, at least. Mentally, it's been a process." She nodded, closing her book and gesturing for him to sit. "That's normal. Recovery isn't just about the body, it's about everything else too." James sat beside her, feeling an odd sense of comfort in her presence. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly for what you did. You were there when I needed someone, even when I couldn't speak." She smiled gently. "It was my job, but I'm glad I could help. You've come a long way since then." They fell into an easy conversation, the heaviness in James's chest easing with each word. Her name was Rachel, and she spoke with a quiet strength that reminded him of what he had lost and what he might find again. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, he laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even himself. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Rachel glanced at her watch. "I should get going. It was really good to see you, James." "You too," he said, standing as she gathered her things. "Maybe we could do this again sometime?" Rachel paused, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'd like that." As she walked away, James watched her until she disappeared from view. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of something he hadn't thought possible. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that he was still capable of moving forward. The following day, James took another step toward reclaiming his life. He boxed up the remnants of Emily's presence in the house, clearing the space for something new. It was a painful process, each object a reminder of what they had shared, but it was necessary. With each box he sealed, he felt a little lighter. Later that evening, he picked up his phone and hesitated before dialing a number he hadn't called in years. When his mother answered, her voice warm and familiar, he realized how much he had missed her. They talked for hours, catching up on everything he had avoided during his marriage. She didn't press him for details about Emily, sensing that he wasn't ready to share, but her quiet support was exactly what he needed. The days that followed were filled with small victories. James ventured out more, reconnecting with old friends and finding solace in their company. He began to rediscover the passions he had neglected: reading, playing guitar, and even cooking meals he once enjoyed. Each step was a reminder that his life wasn't over. It was just beginning again. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, he saw Rachel again. This time she was sitting by the fountain, watching the water cascade in shimmering arcs. She looked up as he approached, her smile lighting up her face. "Back so soon?" she teased. "I guess I'm making this a habit," he replied, sitting beside her. They talked for hours, their conversations ranging from light-hearted anecdotes to deeper reflections on life and loss. Rachel shared stories of her work, the challenges and rewards of being a nurse, and James found himself drawn to her honesty and resilience. She didn't shy away from his pain, but she also didn't let it define him. As the evening turned to dusk, James realized he didn't want the moment to end. "Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" he asked, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. Rachel's eyes softened, and she nodded. "I'd love to." Walking away from the park that night, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in months. He was still healing, still piecing together the fragments of his life. But for the first time, he believed that something beautiful could come from the wreckage. The evening was still, the faint hum of cicadas filling the air as James sat on his back porch, staring at the fading light of the sunset. The past weeks had been transformative, a slow but deliberate process of rebuilding a life he thought he'd lost. But tonight felt different. Hope lingered, more tangible than it had been in a long time. His dinner with Rachel was just a day away, and while part of him was nervous, a greater part was eager to embrace this new beginning. The next day, James prepared for the evening with a sense of anticipation. He spent hours in the kitchen, cooking a dish he hadn't made in years: grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. The act of cooking, of creating something, filled him with a quiet pride. The house, too, felt different. The traces of Emily's presence had been replaced with warmth, light, and the promise of something new. When the doorbell rang, James felt his chest tighten. He took a steadying breath and opened the door to see Rachel standing there, her auburn hair catching the golden glow of the setting sun. She wore a simple dress, her smile radiating a kindness that made him feel instantly at ease. "This smells amazing," she said as she stepped inside, glancing toward the dining table where James had carefully set out their meal. "I hope it tastes as good as it smells," James replied, his voice tinged with both humor and sincerity. The dinner was more than just a meal. It was a conversation, a connection. They talked about everything, from childhood memories to the struggles that had shaped them into who they were. Rachel shared stories of her patience, the moments that had broken her heart, and the ones that had reminded her why she loved her work. James, in turn, opened up about his recovery, his fears, and the betrayal that had nearly broken him. As the evening wore on, James found himself staring at Rachel, marveling at the way her laughter seemed to light up the room. She wasn't just a reminder of the kindness he'd experienced during his darkest days. She was a beacon, a symbol of the life he was fighting to reclaim. After dinner, they moved to the living room where the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Rachel noticed the guitar leaning against the wall and raised an eyebrow. "Do you play?" she asked, her curiosity evident. I used to, James admitted. It's been a while. Play something for me? She asked, her voice soft but encouraging. James hesitated, then nodded. He picked up the guitar, his fingers brushing against the strings as he tuned it. The first few notes were shaky, but as he played, the music flowed more naturally, filling the room with a melody that was both haunting and beautiful. Rachel listened intently, her gaze never leaving him. When he finished, she clapped softly, her smile wide. That was incredible. James felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in what felt like years. Thank you, he said, setting the guitar aside. It felt good to play again. Rachel leaned back, her expression thoughtful. You're rebuilding, James, and it's amazing to see. Her words struck a chord in him. For so long, he had felt like he was merely surviving. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was truly living. As the night drew to a close, Rachel stood to leave, but there was a hesitation in her movements as if she didn't want the evening to end. James walked her to the door, his heart pounding as he considered his next words. Rachel, he began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Tonight was more than I could have hoped for. Thank you. She smiled, her eyes meeting his. Thank you, James, for the dinner, the music, everything. There was a moment of silence, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, without thinking, James leaned forward and kissed her. It was soft, tentative, but it carried all the emotions he had been holding back. The hope, the gratitude, the desire to move forward. When they pulled away, Rachel's cheeks were flushed, but her smile was brighter than ever. Good night, James, she said, her voice warm. Good night, Rachel, he replied, watching as she walked down the path and disappeared into the night. James closed the door and leaned against it, a smile spreading across his face. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The darkness of the past had finally begun to lift, and the future stretched out before him full of possibility. In the days that followed, James found himself thinking of Rachel often. Their connection had reignited something within him, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. He started taking small steps to build a new life, from picking up old hobbies to reconnecting with friends he had lost touch with. Each day was a reminder that he was stronger than he had believed. One evening, as James sat on his porch, watching the stars blink into existence, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Rachel. She had sent a picture of the park fountain, its waters illuminated by soft lights, with a simple caption, Miss this place? James smiled and typed a reply, Only with you there. As he set the phone down, he realized something profound. His life wasn't just about surviving Emily's betrayal or recovering from his injuries. It was about rediscovering the joy of living, of connecting, of loving. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined him. James was moving forward, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. And with Rachel by his side, he knew the journey would be worth every step. And so, James found the strength to rebuild his life, leaving behind the pain of betrayal and embracing a future filled with hope and love. His journey reminds us all that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance for a new beginning. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments what you think. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us create more incredible stories just for you.